growing number of business associations and companies are currently calling for mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations within the workplace. Now, this is to minimize negative impact of the pandemic on the economy. Labour lawyer Jacqui Reed joins us now to unpack basic guidelines that employers can use to implement mandatory vaccination policies. And Jacqui, I appreciate your time this morning. Quite important. We're seeing more and more companies coming out and implementing these policies. Discovery leading previously. We saw MTN now being the latest to obviously introduce these mandatory vaccination policies in the workplace. So what are the guidelines for employers to follow when implementing this policy?
Indeed, thank you. Good morning. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to establish whether or not you fall under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The significant majority of employers do fall within this act. If you don't, then you probably fall under the Mine Health and Safety Act. But the direction relates to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and that is where the mandatory vaccinations issue is dealt with. So the first thing you need to do is establish whether or not you're covered by that act. The second thing you need to do is then you need to establish whether or not you want to implement a mandatory vaccination policy at your workplace. A number of employers have indicated that rather than require employees to vaccinate, they are attempting to encourage and educate employees to vaccinate rather than introducing the policy. However, what has been found, and particularly this is noticeable from, if we look at France, for example, before France introduced the vaccine passport, there was a 43% uptake in the vaccination. And after they introduced the passport, there's now a 77% uptake. So the issue here is that it seems that vaccine mandates work. Discovery is another example of where that has happened, where before they introduced the mandatory vaccination policy, they had quite a low rate of vaccine uptake. And afterwards, once they're only due to implement in January, but they've been going through this process for about 6 months now, and they're at 94%. So it's clear that mandatory vaccinations work. So what you do is, as an employer, you conduct a risk assessment, and the risk assessment involves you looking at your workplace and seeing whether or not you require mandatory vaccinations in the workplace and why you would require that. So you would look at things like non-pharmaceutical interventions, whether or not there's sufficient ventilation. A lot of offices don't actually have ventilation in the sense that you can open the windows. You have a lot of office blocks where you just have these large windows that are not that you're not able to open because you're in a tall office block. And then things like social distancing. Some employers only have open plan offices. They don't have individual offices for people. Some people share offices. So it would depend on the nature of the business and the layout, effectively, of the company in order to establish the risk assessment. You then got to look at your employees as well, and you've got to determine the nature of their health and whether or not there are certain employees that need to be protected from COVID-19 because they have comorbidities such as diabetes or HIV, for example, or any other disease which would make them immunosuppressed and make them make it more probable that they could contract the virus.
If I can just jump in there, Jacqui, you're saying that this risk assessment is important because of that, right? To see if this policy is necessary to be implemented or not, but also to do some sort of a review of, obviously, the workplace in terms of everyone's health and safety against COVID or any other ailments. And it's the responsibility of the employer to conduct that.
Yes, and you would also establish whether or not you want all your employees at the workplace or whether or not you want your employees to work from home. Many employers have indicated that working from home 100% of the time is not appropriate, particularly in professional environments where there's a corporate culture that needs to be created with people in the office. Also things like training, where you've got younger, more inexperienced people that are involved in internships and the like. They need to gain experience from the older people within the organization, and it's very difficult for them to do that over Zoom and over Teams. So that would also be a consideration that employers would would look at when determining whether or not it would be appropriate. And then thereafter, you would, in the event that you, and during the risk assessment process, my apologies, you actually consult with the relevant stakeholders. So if you've got trade unions in the workplace, consult with them. If you've only got employees and employee representatives, you consult with them. If you've got health and safety representatives or a health and safety committee, you consult with them. So it's a very much a consultative process. And my view is, in fact, that what you will do, what will in fact happen, is that employees that are going to object to a mandatory vaccination policy are probably going to object at that point. And it's very important that at that stage of the process, you engage with employees properly and meaningfully, so that you can ensure that you understand what their objections are, and you can address those objections right there and then, so that you have as little pushback as possible in the event that you decide to implement the policy. Yep. Also very important that you ensure that your consultations are recorded in some manner or the other, because that will go to the fairness of the process in the event that you decide to implement it.
Because those objections can be based on medical ground or religion, or just based on, I don't know, integrity, but you have to basically consider everyone's objectives as an employer, not to be dismissive.
Exactly. So you have to, in terms of the direction, there are either medical grounds or constitutional grounds. Medical grounds is where you have a severe allergic reaction to the second dose of the to the first dose of the vaccine, and or you have a known allergy to one of the components of the COVID vaccine, and so that's a medical ground. Then there are other employees that have indicated, apparently through our discussions with certain employers, that pregnant employees, breastfeeding employees are hesitant about getting the vaccine, and but their hesitancy is temporary, in the sense that they're, obviously being pregnant, you're only pregnant for a certain period of time, and presumably breastfeeding, you only breastfeed for a certain period of time. So it appears that those employees will eventually take up the vaccine, just not at this point. They're nervous about it, even though there does seem to be scientific data that indicates that it is safe during those periods. And then the other ground upon which you can object is a constitutional ground, and that is the right to bodily integrity, the right to religion, the right to freedom of belief or opinion. Now, belief or opinion is an interesting one, because if you have a belief or opinion that is not based on scientific fact, then you won't have a valid objection. In the event that you have a religious objection, you would need to show that a basic tenet of your religion is that you are not permitted to vaccinate at all. And I'm not aware of any religions where that is the case, but perhaps they are.
All right, Jacqui.
And certainly a lot of
we'll have to leave it there due to time, but definitely we've got the steps, the basic guidelines that employers have to consider when implementing this mandatory vaccine policy. Jacqui Reed, employment lawyer, thank you so much for speaking to us this morning. I hope we had more time, but of course, thank you so much for making time for us this morning.